I grew up with Popeye cartoons. I always told my mother that I wanted to get an anchor tattoo like Popeye's. My mother would always say, "When you're older." For many years, I went back and forth, unsure whether I should get the tattoo or not. This year, I finally tattooed my left arm just in time for Halloween. Popeye is fascinating because of his very distinct personality, which many people find entertaining. But behind those seemingly harmless frames lies a chain of deliberate choices. Violence is normalized in a systematic way. And Spinach, the thing that makes Popeye invincible, no longer feels like a simple message about healthy eating, but more like covert advertising. What appears to be an ordinary cartoon actually carries many dark secrets behind the motives that produced it. Today, we are no longer looking at Popeye the way we did as children sitting in front of the screen on a Saturday afternoon. Let's go back and dissect what seems like an innocent Popeye cartoon, 1933, to uncover the layers of violence, disguised propaganda, and dark production motives that were carefully hidden behind the laughter of childhood. 15. Popeye appeared before he was allowed to be the main character. Do you remember the first time you met Popeye? Chances are it wasn't actually a Popeye cartoon. Few viewers realise that Popeye did not debut as a star. His first animated appearance took place on July 14, 1933, in a short film from the Betty Boop series produced by Fleischer Studios and distributed by Paramount Pictures. The short was titled Popeye the Sailor, but in terms of marketing it was still labelled as a Betty Boop cartoon. This was not a mistake, it was a strategy. Behind-the-scenes records show that Max Fleischer, the studio's co-founder, approved this approach as a low-risk test, placing Popeye under the already established spotlight of Betty Boop to measure audience reaction rather than launching a full new series outright. In practice, Betty appears only briefly while Popeye dominates the rhythm through rough action, heavy movement, and slapstick violence. The results exceeded expectations. Theatre reports noted that audiences reacted far more strongly to Popeye than to Betty Boop. Animation historians later described this as one of the smartest soft launches in history. Without an introduction, without explanation, Popeye immediately captured viewers' attention. 14. Spinach was not just a vegetable, it was a propagandistic power drug. A green vegetable that can make a man punch through anything and convince an entire generation to believe it. It sounds ridiculous, but the reality is hard to deny. In Popeye's world, spinach is not food. It is a trigger. Pop open the can, swallow a bite, and power explodes instantly. Muscles bulge and fists become the solution to every conflict. The message is unmistakable. Eat this and you will be strong. But this was not just a cartoon joke. In the 1930s, the United States was facing widespread malnutrition due to the Great Depression. The government and public nutrition campaigns needed a symbol that was easy to remember and easy to spread in order to encourage vegetable consumption, especially spinach, which at the time was incorrectly believed to be extremely high in iron due to a decades-old data error caused by a misplaced decimal point. Popeye became the perfect tool, entertaining mass appeal and instantly effective. The result? Spinach consumption in the United States surged after Popeye became popular. Posters, nutrition pamphlets, and even school lessons cited Popeye as living proof. Only later did science correct the record. Spinach does not grant superhuman strength, and its iron content had been exaggerated. By then, however, the message had already travelled too far. What matters most is how that message was packaged, health told through violence as problem solving. You are not strong in order to live better, you are strong in order to win fights. This stands as one of the earliest examples of stealth advertising in mass animation. A public goal, nutrition promoted through entertainment without labels, without disclosure, and without warning. 13. Violence was legitimized in a systematic way. If you look closely, Popeye does not solve problems. He ends them with his fists. In nearly every Popeye cartoon, the story follows a chillingly consistent formula. A conflict appears. Dialogue fails. A can of spinach is opened. Violence erupts and order is restored. Popeye does not win through reason. He wins through destructive force, often ending with the opponent's body being distorted, knocked out of the frame, or erased in a burst of laughter. The concern is not a single punch, but the repetition of the pattern. Children do not just see violence, they see violence as always correct. Each time Popeye resorts to his fists after being powered up, the cartoon reinforces a simple but dangerous message. When you are strong enough, you no longer need to talk. Media scholars later pointed out that Popeye represents one of the earliest examples of the normalization of violence in animation. Violence is not punished, has no consequences, and is consistently rewarded with laughter, victory, and admiration. It teaches children that physical power is the fastest path to resolving conflict. 12. The strange voice that gave Popeye his soul.
Well, blow me down. You's change his heart to lion. Here comes a guy what thinks he's a fighter. Watch this.
Do you remember it? The moment when Popeye mutters something, his mouth clenched tight, eyes glancing sideways, then suddenly throws out a line no one can clearly hear, but everyone can feel. Popeye's voice was never designed to sound pleasant or heroic. From his very first appearance in 1933, Fleischer Studios chose a direction completely opposite to the polished cartoon characters of the time. The voice was created by Billy Costello, a vaudeville performer known by the nickname Red Pepper Sam. He did not deliver lines clearly. Instead, he forced words through clenched teeth, mumbled, swallowed sounds, creating the impression that Popeye was thinking out loud rather than speaking. This was not an accident. Fleischer wanted Popeye to feel rough, ordinary, and imperfect, more like a real sailor than a stage character. What made it distinctive was how much Costello improvised in the recording booth. He added mutters, meaningless noises, irregular rhythms on his own. The animators did not force the voice to fit the drawings, they did the opposite. They adjusted mouth movements to follow the voice. This practice was extremely rare in the 1930s, and it is precisely what made Popeye feel far more alive than other characters of the same era. 11. A simple song that made Popeye impossible to forget.
I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
From the very first frames, Popeye introduces himself not through dialogue, but through music. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man was created in 1933, written by composer Sammy Lerner, specifically for Fleischer Studios' animated cartoons. No climax, no complexity, just a few repeated lines, a straightforward melody, a steady rhythm. Hear it once, and it sticks. That was not accidental. Fleischer believed that music embeds itself in memory faster than images. A character can be forgotten, but a tune stays. The song was written so children could sing along immediately, even if they didn't fully understand the words. And it worked. The moment Popeye appeared, he was already in the audience's head. Behind the scenes, the song also solved a very practical storytelling problem. Popeye spoke in mumbles hard to understand. Instead of forcing him to speak more clearly, the team used the song to explain who he was, a sailor, strong, confident, needing few words. Animators even timed Popeye's movements to the rhythm, binding action and sound tightly together. In a short time, the melody escaped the theatre heard in schools, homes, and on the streets. Very few animated characters of that era achieved such fast and widespread musical recognition. 10. The animation style that made Popeye impossible to confuse with anyone else. From his debut in 1933, Popeye already looked completely different from the rest of the animated world. Fleischer Studios used the rubber hose animation technique, arms and legs soft like rubber hoses, elastic movement largely ignoring realistic anatomy. But they did not stop at the standard level of the period. They pushed it much further. Animators such as Roland Crandall and Seymour Keitel deliberately exaggerated Popeye's forearms, making them oversized and clearly disproportionate to the rest of his body. This was a conscious visual choice. When Popeye throws a punch, the audience feels the force even without complex, violent detail. Strength is conveyed through shape and motion without the need for effects. Behind the scenes, the Fleischer team believed that movement mattered more than clean drawings. They prioritized energy rhythm and impact over anatomical consistency. As a result, Popeye could be wrong in proportions from frame to frame, but the action always felt alive. Audiences did not notice the flaws they were carried along by the force of motion. That loose, rough style created a clear contrast with smoother, more glamorous characters like Betty Boop. Popeye did not belong to a polished stage. He looked like he stepped out of a hard, gritty world where collisions were real. 9. The borrowed characters that locked the conflict in from the very first frame. Do you remember the image of Olive Oyl being lifted off the ground, arms and legs flailing, while Bluto's massive shadow covers the entire frame? Even before a single punch is thrown, you already know what is about to happen. What few people notice is that Olive Oyl and Bluto were not created for animation. Both come directly from Elzie Chrysler Seeger's Thimble Theatre comic strip. Olive Oyl existed for many years before Popeye appeared, and Bluto was already established as the model of a brutish antagonist. Fleischer Studios preserved the core of these characters but adjusted their designs to serve motion. Olive was drawn with an extremely thin body, allowing for exaggerated bending, stretching and frantic movement. Bluto, by contrast, was animated as a massive force, tall, heavy and often filling the entire frame whenever he appeared. Behind the scenes, Bluto quickly became the perfect visual opponent for Popeye. The difference in size allowed the audience to read the conflict instantly, overwhelming strength versus stubborn endurance. Animators deliberately staged clashes to emphasize force against force without needing verbal explanation. 8. The chaotic production process was stamped directly onto the screen. If you look closely at the early Popeye shorts, everything always seems on the verge of collapse. Walls bend floors, crack characters slam into each other with nothing smooth about it. That was not just a stylistic choice, it was the reality behind the scenes. In the early 1930s, Fleischer Studios operated in a constant race against theatrical demand. Popeye quickly became a box office draw, and theatres needed new cartoons almost every month. The result was an extremely compressed production schedule. Many shorts had only 4 to 6 weeks to be completed, according to animation historians such as Leonard Maltin and Richard Fleischer. Director Dave Fleischer set down a clear principle: movement matters more than clean drawing. Animation teams worked in parallel, with each unit handling different scenes of the same film. There was no time for elaborate corrections. If an arm stretched too far, or a face warped between frames, as long as the punch looked strong and funny, the shot stayed. Internal Fleischer documents now preserved at the Library of Congress show that many scenes were approved after only a single review. This urgency created a raw, distinctive energy. Popeye's world looks chaotic, because the filmmaking process itself was chaotic. This stood in stark contrast to Disney's approach at the same time, where a single scene could be redrawn for weeks to achieve perfectly smooth motion. 7. The moment Popeye exploded and took over the spotlight.
Up, up, up. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
You could hear it right there in the theatre, laughter breaking out before the scene even ended, cheers erupting every time his forearms swelled and a punch flew. That was the moment Popeye was no longer a new character, he became a phenomenon. By the end of 1933, Popeye had surpassed every expectation of the animation industry. Theatre owners sent reports back to Paramount Pictures stating that audiences reacted more strongly to Popeye than to any other animated character playing in the same program. Leonard Maltin noted in Of Mice and Magic that many theatres had to change the screening order to put Popeye first, because if he appeared later, audiences would leave early. Popularity surveys from the early to mid-1930s, later compiled in Motion Picture Herald records, show that for a period of time Popeye matched, and in some cases even surpassed, Mickey Mouse. In audience favour, something almost unthinkable, at a moment when Disney was dominating the image of ideal animation. Fleischer Studios reacted extremely quickly. Max Fleischer saw Popeye as living proof that a rough, violent, unpolished character could still become a box office star. The studio immediately expanded Popeye into a full theatrical series and redirected its best talent to the sailor animators known for powerful motion and heavy impact were reassigned to Popeye instead of Betty Boop. 6. The early scenes are now handled with caution. Not every detail in the early Popeye cartoons has aged smoothly. Some scenes reflect visual stereotypes and social attitudes that were common in the 1930s elements that later became controversial when viewed through a modern lens. As a result, in many contemporary television broadcasts and re-releases, these moments are often cut blurred or altered. At the time of production, Fleischer Studios did not see these elements as a problem. They simply reflected the social norms of the era. However, animation historians emphasize that placing these cartoons within their proper historical context is essential. There is no official documentation indicating deliberate intent to cause harm, but the impact of the imagery still exists and must be acknowledged. For that reason, some Popeye shorts are rarely shown uncut on mainstream platforms today. Restoration teams at Paramount Pictures have carefully documented every change made across re-releases, turning these edits themselves into an additional layer of historical record. 5. Popeye's creator never set foot in the studio. Elzie Chrysler. Sega, the creator of Popeye, never worked directly with Fleischer Studios. In other words, he never stepped into the studio, yet the entire studio had to follow him. Behind the scenes, Fleischer's artists did not try to draw Popeye to look better than he did in the comics. They did something far more difficult. They preserved Sega's spirit. They studied every panel of thimble theatre to learn the rhythm, the attitude, and the distinctly human stubbornness of Popeye. As a result, the Popeye on screen remained tough, loyal, and rough. Yet beneath that surface was a quiet, emotional life exactly as Sega had written him. Sega died in 1938, just as Popeye was beginning to become a phenomenon. What is remarkable is that the character did not drift away from his origins after his creator's death. Animation historians often cite Popeye as a rare case in which the animated version respected the original comic so faithfully that it was almost conservative. 4. The studio takeover that changed the tone.
One for Olive, one for Popeye, Popeye, and one for Popeye.
If you look closely, you can sense a strange moment. The skies feel less gloomy, the shadows less harsh. Popeye's world looks cleaner and something seems to have slipped away. There is no explanation on screen, but there is one behind the scenes. In 1942, Fleischer Studios officially lost control. Paramount Pictures took over and renamed the studio Famous Studios. Popeye continued to appear on screen, but from one short to the next, the tone began to shift. The animation became neater, the colours brighter and more even, the rhythm less chaotic with fewer moments that felt like they were about to burst out of the frame. The warped angles and barely controlled motion hallmarks of the Fleischer era gradually disappeared. For younger audiences, this made the cartoons easier to watch, but for long-time viewers, the familiar roughness had faded. Behind the scenes, Famous Studios prioritized stability and efficiency. Production was standardized. Creative risk was reduced. Popeye no longer lived in a world that felt constantly on the verge of collapse, but in one that had been carefully tidied up. What is remarkable is that Popeye survived. While many characters faded after studio takeovers, Popeye adapted. Still, those earlier shorts, with their darker tones and wild emotion, retain a feeling that can never truly be recreated. 3. Why animation schools still use Popeye for teaching.
Here they come, all of us, senior.
If one day you walk into a serious animation class in the United States, the kind where students sit silently, the lights are turned off and the instructor stands with folded arms at the back, there is one scene that is likely to surprise you. On the screen, it is not Pixar, not modern Disney, not Japanese anime. It is black and white Popeye grainy scratched, filmed in the 1930s. Young students look up at first, slightly confused. The character is rough. The drawings distorted, nothing glossy or polished. But the instructor does not rush to explain. They let Popeye step into the frame, squint. His eyes drop his shoulders, clench his fist, and the entire class begins to understand the character before he speaks a single word. That is exactly why Popeye is still here. At schools such as CalArts, the School of Visual Arts and USC Fleischer era, Popeye shorts are used as a foundational lesson, storytelling through movement, not dialogue. Students are asked to observe that with just a standing pose, a step forward, or a slight body lean, the audience already knows whether Popeye is angry, hesitating, or about to explode. Animation researcher Richard Williams once said that Popeye is a perfect example of clarity of action, where a character's body communicates their thoughts before the mouth even opens. No effects, no spectacle, just physical form and timing. 2. An imperfect hero who changed how animation sees heroes.
Who is this half-pint?
Oh, that's Popeye.
Yes, sir.
He wants to marry me.
Oh, yeah? Well, you're too late.
Try to recall the animated heroes many of us grew up with. Most of them were handsome, upright, spoke clearly, and always seemed to know exactly what to do. They represented what was right and rarely made viewers uncomfortable. Popeye was nothing like that. From his very first appearance, he looked more like a problem than a solution. An odd body, forearms swollen to unnatural size, a face permanently locked in a scowl. He muttered lines no one could fully understand, lost his temper, easily showed obvious jealousy, and often solved trouble with his fists before thinking about the consequences. What matters is this Fleischer Studios saw all of those traits and chose to keep them. At a time when animation was trying to become cuter and more rounded, Max Fleischer and Dave Fleischer went in the opposite direction. They did not try to smooth Popeye out. They turned that roughness into his identity. Popeye was not an ideal model. He felt closer to a real human being than almost any animated character of his era. Animators like Seymour Keitel and Roland Crandall knew exactly what they were doing. They let Popeye's movements stay sharp and decisive, sometimes almost brutal. There was no cute smoothness. Every step, Every clenched fist revealed an inner life on the verge of boiling over. And audiences responded, not because Popeye was the best man, but because he felt the most real. 1. The 1933 short that never left the screen. Popeye's 1933 debut short has not aged in the way people usually assume. It does not simply sit quietly in animation history books, it is still being actively searched for. To this day, film archives, private collectors, and animation historians continue to hunt for surviving prints in the best possible condition. The reason is practical and stark. Early theatrical cartoons were projected repeatedly until the film stock wore down, then cut, reissued, altered, and sometimes spliced together. Every surviving print is a fragile fragment of history, and when people revisit it, they understand why it is worth preserving. The film captures Fleischer Studios at full throttle rubber hose motion, bursting outward, extreme poses gags that hit the viewer before the mind has time to react. There is no patience for meticulous polish. Energy beats elegance. Personality beats perfection. So what about you? Which moment from Popeye 1933 is the one you remember most? Leave a comment. And if you want to continue unlocking other deleted scenes from Hollywood's golden age, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. You will be surprised by what Hollywood has kept hidden from you for decades.